My wife said, "Sign whatever, you'll own nothing after the merger anyway," and laughed as she slid the postnuptial agreement across the table. I signed it. 6 months later, at the federal hearing, her attorney went pale when the compliance officer opened the single notice on the table and said, "Ma'am, this agreement triggered an automatic forfeiture clause the moment you filed. He now holds full." I signed it. She poured herself more wine, watched me write my name, and did not even pick the document up to read it. That detail matters. She did not read it. The agreement was 4 pages long, double-spaced, and she did not read a single word. She already knew what she thought it said, because she assumed I was doing what desperate husbands do when a marriage is failing, which is make concessions, give things away, negotiate from a position of fear. She assumed I was scared of losing her. She assumed the paper in front of me was a surrender. It was not a surrender. It was a filing trigger, and she had just signed it. And in 6 months, at a federal regulatory hearing for a pharmaceutical acquisition worth more than most people can picture in their minds, a compliance officer was going to open a single document on a table and read it aloud, and her attorney was going to go pale, and everything she thought she had already won was going to be gone. But I am getting ahead of myself. You need to understand how we got there, because the ending only makes sense when you know the beginning, and the beginning is not flattering to me. I made mistakes. I trusted the wrong person for a long time, and I have spent enough time sitting with that to say it plainly. Her name was Renata. We met when I was 31 at a conference in Boston. She was sharp, well-presented, and funny in a way that felt effortless. I was in early-stage deal sourcing then, working for a mid-sized private equity group that specialized in life sciences. I was not wealthy by any stretch. I was comfortable. I had a track record and a network and a belief that I was going somewhere, but I did not have the kind of money that changes what a room looks like when you walk into it. Renata came from a family that did. Her father had built a regional hospital supply company over 30 years and sold it for enough money that her generation did not need to work unless they chose to. She chose to work, which I respected. She was in marketing consulting, building her own client list, and she was good at it. In those early years, that independence was real. She was not looking to be supported. She was building something. We got married 3 years after we met. The wedding was in Portugal, small and expensive, and I remember feeling like I had arrived somewhere. Not because of her family's money, but because of her, or who I thought she was. The shift was gradual enough that I kept explaining it away. When I moved into acquisition work full-time and started closing deals, the attention I was getting from the industry started to change the way Renata talked about my work. She began referring to my deals as our portfolio in conversations with other people. She started attending more events with me, which I initially took as interest, but which I came to understand was positioning. She wanted to be seen as part of what I was building, which would have been fine, except she was not part of it. She was adjacent to it, and over time she began to confuse those two things. Her consulting work slowed down, then it stopped. She said she was between clients, that she was being selective. That stretched from 6 months to a year to 2 years. By year 4 of our marriage, she had not worked in any real sense, and when I raised it gently, she looked at me like I had said something offensive. She said she was managing our household. We had a house manager. We also had no children. What she was managing, mostly, was her social life, which had become elaborate and expensive and centered on a group of women whose husbands were all in finance or law or medicine. I want to be precise here because I do not want this to sound like the ordinary complaint of a man frustrated with a spouse who spends money. That would be too simple. The real issue was what she began doing with information. She started talking about my deals, not in vague terms, in specific terms. At dinners, at lunches, in conversations with people I did not know well, she would mention companies I was evaluating, timelines I had shared with her privately, terms that were under confidentiality. The first time I became aware of it, I told myself it was careless. The second time, I had a direct conversation with her and she minimized it completely. She said I was being paranoid. She said her friends were not in the industry and it did not matter. The third time, I found out through a source that someone in her social circle had shorted a position in a company I was actively evaluating for acquisition. The timing was not provable as connected to her, but the timing was not comfortable either. I documented it anyway. I noted the date, the source, the company, the position. I put it in a folder and I said nothing. The fourth incident was worse. I was in the final phase of evaluating Qley Therapeutics, a mid-sized specialty pharma company with a promising oncology pipeline. The acquisition was sensitive. There were regulatory layers, licensing considerations, and a federal review process that made confidentiality not just professionally important, but legally significant. I had made the mistake of telling Renata we were close to a term sheet. Just that, nothing more. Within 2 weeks, I started getting calls from a competing acquirer who seemed to know details about our valuation approach that should not have been available to them. Nothing was ever proven. The deal still closed, but it closed harder than it needed to, and the competing interest drove the price up in ways that cost us real money. After that, I stopped telling Renata anything about active deals. I told her I was working on things, that I was busy, generalities. She noticed the distance, and she did not like it. By year 5 of our marriage, the atmosphere in our home had changed entirely. She was resentful, not because I had done anything wrong, but because the access she had expected, access to information, to status by proximity, to the feeling of being inside something important, had been quietly removed. She started making comments, consistent, calibrated comments designed to diminish. At dinner with her friends, she would say things like, "He is always certain a deal is going to close, and then something falls through. It is very stressful." She said it with a sympathetic smile, the kind that signals to the room that she is the patient one. At her sister's birthday, she said, in front of 4 people I barely knew, that she sometimes worried I was not as disciplined with risk as I believed. She was planting a narrative. The narrative was that I was unreliable, that my confidence was a kind of delusion, that she was the steady presence managing the fallout of my ego. I watched her do it. I said nothing. I documented it. By year 6, she had begun consulting a divorce attorney. I know this because I am thorough, and thoroughness is a professional habit I do not switch off. I did not surveil her, but I paid attention to what was in our shared accounts, to patterns, to timing. The retainer she paid came from a personal account she had opened 18 months earlier. She had been planning this for a year and a half. What she had not planned for was Qley Therapeutics. After the earlier deal for a different company fell through, I had gone back to Qley. The company was still available, the pipeline was still compelling, and I spent the better part of the following year rebuilding the acquisition case from scratch. By the time I was ready to move seriously, I was doing so through a newly structured acquisition entity I had established, separate from any fund I had worked with before. This was my deal, my capital, my structure, my risk. The acquisition of Qley required federal regulatory approval because of the nature of some of its licensing. That approval process takes time. During that waiting period, something else was taking shape at home. I had consulted a very specific kind of attorney, not a divorce attorney, a contract attorney who specialized in financial instruments and marital property law in the context of business transactions. I explained my situation carefully. I told him about the active acquisition, the regulatory process, the timeline, and the marriage. I told him what I suspected was coming and when. He listened for a long time, and then he asked me a question I had already been thinking about. He asked whether I had considered formalizing the asset structure in a way that was transparent, legal, and protected. We drafted the postnuptial agreement together. It took 11 weeks. It was reviewed by 3 separate attorneys before it was finalized. On its surface, it was an agreement that formalized Renata's claim to the marital home, to a generous spousal support structure, and to a percentage of investment income from any fund vehicles I had been part of during our marriage. It read as a concession. It read as a man trying to be fair in a marriage that was struggling. What it also contained, in language that was dense but entirely standard in acquisition contract law, was a forfeiture clause. The clause stated that any filing of divorce proceedings by either party during an active federal acquisition review period, involving any entity in which the signing party held a marital property interest, would trigger an automatic reversion of that interest to the acquiring principal. The clause was not hidden. It was in the agreement. It was in the language she did not read. I brought it home on a Tuesday evening. I told her I wanted to formalize some things, given where we were. I told her I thought it was fair, that it protected her. She read the title page and the support numbers, and she stopped there. She slid it back to me. She told me to sign whatever I wanted, because after the merger, I would not own anything anyway. She had been talking to people. She had a picture in her mind of how this was going to go. In that picture, the acquisition would close, the value would crystallize inside our marriage, and when she filed, she would walk away with half of something that had taken me 6 years to build. She signed the agreement. I signed the agreement. It was notarized the following morning. 43 days later, she filed for divorce. The federal review for the Corvin acquisition was still active. The filing triggered the clause the moment it was recorded. Not when I responded to it. Not when any court ruled on anything. The moment her attorney filed the petition, the forfeiture clause activated automatically under the terms of the agreement she had signed. Her marital property interest in the acquisition entity reverted to me as the acquiring principal. This is what the clause said. This is what a notarized agreement she had signed said. I did not call her. I did not send a message. I let the compliance process do what the compliance process was designed to do. The federal regulatory hearing for the Corvan acquisition was scheduled for a Thursday morning. It was a standard confirmation proceeding. The compliance officer, a woman named Diane, had been assigned to the case several months earlier and had reviewed every document in the acquisition file, including the postnuptial agreement, which had been submitted as part of the marital asset disclosure required for the ownership structure review. Renata's attorney had attended the hearing because divorce proceedings were active and he believed there was a marital interest to protect. He had filed a notice of interest with the regulatory body. He was there to observe, to establish presence, to make sure that whatever was confirmed at that hearing was noted as subject to the divorce proceedings. Diane opened the hearing. She introduced herself and identified the matter. She noted that a notice of interest had been filed by a third party. She said, in the way that compliance officers say things, which is carefully and without drama, that before confirming the acquisition structure, she needed to address the third-party notice directly. She placed a single document on the table. She said that the postnuptial agreement on record contained a forfeiture clause tied to the filing of divorce proceedings during an active federal review period. She said the clause had been activated automatically upon the filing of the petition 43 days prior. She said that as of the date of that filing, the marital property interest previously held by the third party had reverted to the acquiring principal under the terms of the agreement. She then confirmed that the notice of interest filed by the third-party attorney had no legal basis to affect the acquisition structure, as the interest it claimed no longer existed. She said it the way you read an instruction manual. Plainly, with no inflection. Renata's attorney did not say anything immediately. He looked at the document. Then he looked at me. His face did not have a specific expression. It just had less blood in it than it had a moment before. He asked if he could have a moment to review the agreement. Diane said he was welcome to review any document in the public record at his convenience and that the hearing would continue. Renata was not in the room. She was in the hallway. Her attorney went to speak with her after the hearing confirmed the acquisition structure without any encumbrance. I heard later that she asked him 3 times whether what had happened was real, whether there was something that could be done, whether the agreement could be challenged. He told her the agreement was valid, notarized, and unambiguous. He told her she had signed it. She had signed it. The divorce proceeded on the terms the agreement had established before the forfeiture: the marital home, the spousal support structure, the fund vehicle percentages. All of that remained. She received what the agreement said she would receive in the event of a divorce. What she did not receive was any portion of the Corvin acquisition, which was the thing she had been planning around for 18 months. The thing she had assumed was already hers. Her attorney filed a motion to challenge the forfeiture clause on the grounds that she had not been represented by independent counsel when she signed. The motion was reviewed. The court found that the agreement had been provided to her in advance of signing, that she had been given sufficient time to seek counsel, and that no evidence existed that she had been misled or pressured. The motion was denied. Her social circle reacted the way social circles do, which is unevenly. Some of the women she had spent 6 years cultivating disappeared quickly. 2 of them, whose husbands knew me professionally, reached out to me directly. Not to take sides, but in the careful, indirect way of people recalibrating. The narrative Renata had been building, the one where I was the unreliable one, the one where her patience had been the thing holding things together, did not survive the hearing. Her sister called me once. I did not take the call. There was nothing to say that would have mattered to either of us. The competing acquirer who had driven up the Corvan price 18 months earlier made a comment at an industry event about the forfeiture clause. He said it with something that I think was intended as criticism but landed as respect. He said, "That is an interesting piece of paperwork." I told him it was a standard instrument in the right context. He looked at me for a moment and then changed the subject. The Corvan acquisition closed fully 4 months after the hearing. The oncology pipeline performed ahead of projection in the first operating year. The team there is good, the regulatory pathway is cleaner than I initially modeled, and the investment is doing what I believed it would do when I first evaluated the company years ago. I live in a different city now. I rent an apartment that is smaller than the house we shared, and I do not miss the house. I have a desk that faces a window, a coffee routine I have not varied in 8 months, and a schedule that belongs entirely to me. I am working on 2 new evaluations. One of them is promising in a way that reminds me of early Corvan. I do not spend much time thinking about Renata. When I do, what I think about is not the marriage or the divorce or the hearing. What I think about is that Tuesday evening. The way she looked at the document I had spent 11 weeks building with precision, looked at it for approximately 45 seconds, and pushed it back across the table to me. The certainty she had. The complete, unearned certainty that she already knew what it said. She laughed when she told me I would own nothing after the merger. She had not read the page.